I'm Keith Spera from NOLA.com and the Times-Picayune. Welcome to Let's Talk. If Mike Haas is the voice of the Saints on WWL Radio, my guest today is a voice of the Saints in the pages of the Times-Picayune. He spent 25 years covering the team through the highest of highs and the lowest of lows. His latest book project is a collaboration with Saints hero Steve Gleason on Gleason's memoir of living with ALS called A Life Impossible. Here to talk about all that and more is my colleague, Jeff Duncan. Jeff, welcome to Let's Talk, buddy.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Keith. Really excited about today.
So there are some parallels between what you do and what I do. I predominantly write about music. You write about sports. People in this city are very passionate about both of those things. I am always asked, oh, do you play an instrument? So are you asked, oh, do you play sports?
All the time, yeah. I mean, people think, and even athletes, right, some of the Saints players want to know my background as an athlete, and as usual, most of us were failed at what we did and ended up identifying. So my background growing up in Louisville, Kentucky, I played high school sports. I didn't get beyond that. But I went to college originally, Keith, to study wildlife management at Eastern Kentucky University, and thought I was going to be petting little furry animals in a zoo or going out and checking fishing licenses. And instead it was organic chemistry, comparative anatomy, and I was like, whoa, whoa here, this is not what I signed up for. I was always a talented writer. It came easy to me, and I love sports. My brother was in journalism, 6 years older, at Western Kentucky University. He said, you ought to try journalism. Mm-hmm. And so I transferred to the University of Louisville, where my mother worked, got into sports journalism. Seemed like a good way to kind of combine my two passions, and lo and behold, I've been doing it ever since.
Was your degree in journalism?
Yes, at the University of Louisville, and my mother worked in the med school there, so I got a free ride. Didn't have to deal with student loans. Very fortunate in that regard. And my senior year, working at the Louisville Cardinal, the student newspaper, we won the national championship in men's basketball, 1986. I'm dating myself, but it was an incredible experience for a young journalist to be able to cover that as the sports editor of our paper down in Dallas. So yeah, and just fell in love with what I was doing, and worked my way through college at the Courier-Journal, which was a dominant newspaper in the South when I was there. Used to be owned by the Bingham family, a family-owned paper, and very well-read newspaper. So I got an early start in seeing what it's like to work at a paper where your work resonates with the readership. Mm-hmm. And we certainly have had that throughout my tenure down here at the Times-Picayune, which I'm sure you would agree. It's just a unique place to work for us. What you write about, what I write about resonates, because both of those, I think, are cultural totems in our community. That's a good way to put it, right? The passion, and I love it. I feel very fortunate to be in the role I've been in here.
When you say it resonates with readers, does that mean that you hear from readers? Do they let you know what they think about what you write?
You could say that a few times, especially on social media. So what I learned on social media, covering the Saints, and that's a whole different world, right, social media.
Yeah.
But what I learned early on is people lose their minds during a Saints game. Normally rational, logical people, professional people, family, men and women, they are not themselves. They are very emotional, and I love it. They're very passionate about this team. So I learned early on, you just have to give them Sunday to vent, because they're not logical. And early on, I didn't realize that. I was like, well, you're blocked. I can't put up with that vulgarity, cussing me out because I tweeted something.
Right.
But I've learned, you just give them rope, and they usually come back to earth the next day. But that passion doesn't go on everywhere. I think what I learned when I first took over the Saints beat here, so I started in '99 at the Picayune, was hired to cover LSU sports. So I'd moved from Nashville, worked in Nashville for a couple of years, and came down to Baton Rouge. And you know what it's like when you get on a beat for the first time. It takes you about a year to get to know people on the beat, and for the people to get to know you. It takes a while to get comfortable. I'd moved around in my career. I'd worked down in Florida at a couple of stints, worked in Nashville, worked a little bit at USA Today. So I'd moved a lot, and that's what you have to do sometimes in our profession. You have to kind of climb the ladder. So I was comfortable in Baton Rouge, covered Jerry DiNardo's last year in '99. We all knew he was probably going to get fired. And he did get fired.
Yep.
And then a month later, I covered Nick Saban's hiring. We broke that story. Josh Peter, old colleague of ours, and myself collaborated, broke that story on the front page of the paper. That was back when you didn't really have the internet.
Online, right,
yeah, you didn't have the online.
Right.
We broke that in the newspaper the next day. I'll never forget the headline, 1.2 million in World War III type font, because that's what his salary was going to be. It seemed like an enormous amount back then. But that story was a huge boost for my career, and I was invited basically to ask me if I wanted to cover the New Orleans Saints. And I'd just gotten settled in Baton Rouge. I'd just gotten to know everybody. So it was actually a difficult decision, but I knew the Saints were popular here, and also, frankly, I wanted to live in New Orleans.
Well, sure.
Right?
Sure, I could see that, yeah.
So I made the move reluctantly to some degree. Had to get, find a new place to live, had to find a new doctor, a new barber, all the things that you go through. But I did it, and I mention all this because I didn't quite know the passion. When I worked throughout the South, I covered mainly college sports, SEC. I knew about the Green Bay Packers' passionate fan base. I knew about the Pittsburgh Steelers, Kansas City Chiefs, some of the hallmark franchises. I didn't know New Orleans had this passionate following. It just was, foreign to me. So when I got on the beat the first year, the team had these horrible years under Mike Ditka. They'd been kind of a clown franchise, embarrassing to some degree. In the first year, they hired Jim Haslett, Randy Mueller. They go 10-6. They win the division. The city's on fire. They win their first playoff game in the history of the franchise, and it just seemed like this magic carpet ride. And I really got to realize just how passionate the fans were, how into the sport they were. And ever since then, I can't imagine covering anything else. But I didn't know that when I moved here. So the more I learned about the history of the team, you realize how far back this passion for football goes, all the way back to Dave Dixon and the shenanigans they pulled just to get a team here, classic Louisiana politics. I love that passion. So if it sometimes veers off the tracks a little bit, that's okay. It's better than apathy.
Exactly. You'd rather have something to write about and people be enthused about what you
100%.
do than not. Absolutely. If you're just tuning in, my guest today is Time-Speaking and NOLA.com sports columnist Jeff Duncan. Fans have gotten upset with you, obviously, over the years. So have coaches and players, I would imagine.
Yes.
You've been yelled at by coaches?
Yes, oh yeah. Jim Haslett was a very big man, former linebacker. Got in my face once after something I wrote. He was very upset about I was exposing an injury to Willie Roaf that he'd want. And they just happened to be playing, Keith, the New England Patriots, who had not blossomed into this dynasty yet.
Right.
It was the early days of Bill Belichick and Tom Brady. And I'd exposed that Willie Roaf was hurt in practice, and that was going to tip them off that he might not play.
This is the great lineman, offensive lineman for the Saints, right?
Hall of Famer, yes.
Key player, yeah.
And I remember coming to practice the next day after I'd written that, and Jim Haslett got in my face. He's about 6'4", 250, workout warrior, still looked like he could play, and I thought I was going to end up an oil spot on the ground. And he did this in front of me, screaming, veins in his neck, red-faced, in front of all the other media. And I thought, well, at least someone's going to document this bludgeoning, this assault, and I'm going to maybe get something out of it. But it was ugly, and I have to say, to Jim's credit, the next morning he called, apologized, and ended up feeding me a huge scoop. It's almost like a quid pro quo in apology. I broke the story that Willie Roaf was going to have season-ending surgery and be out for the year, which is a huge story. But he felt bad about it, and look, that happens. I mean, we're going to be in confrontation sometimes. It's part of the job. If you're not doing your job if you're not, angering some people sometimes, because they're going to disagree with what you write. Especially now that I'm a columnist. For years I was a beat reporter. You just stick to the facts, cover the games, write the transactions, write a feature story here and there. Now you're as a columnist, you have to write your opinion. Now everybody's going to agree with that opinion. And that really, probably the worst period of that time, as far as my career, was during Bountygate, when the Saints were kind of riding high after winning the Super Bowl in 2009, and this story comes down that they have an investigation by the league over a bounty program, and I knew it was going to be big, and I took a pretty critical stance against the organization at the time. And there's still some fans that have never forgiven me for that.
And that was the deal where certain coaches were supposedly paying players or putting a bounty on hurting opposing players or something like that.
Right.
Basically boiling it down.
Yeah, and my critique of the organization at the time was not about the bounty program itself, which was very common, I think, practice around the league, kind of black on the black market, if you will. Like that stuff went on culturally. It was the fact that the organization covered it up. It was basically like Watergate. It's the cover up, not the crime. And the Saints did not handle that. They destroyed evidence. They lied about it, and that created harsher penalties because of their response, as opposed to just coming clean. I had NFL sources say if the Saints would have just admitted what was going on, they would have gotten a slap on the wrist. Instead, it was one of the harshest penalties ever. They deserve to be criticized. But what I've learned about New Orleans, it's one of the greatest things about living here, and one of the also, I think, curses of living here, is it's very provincial, right?
Yeah.
So there's very much. I found this phrase that I've used a few times in my columns over the years, and it's a French phrase, esprit de cloche, and what it loosely translates to is the spirit of the clock tower, and it comes from medieval French times when the villages would have all have a watchtower, a clock tower in the center of the village, and anyone, the legend goes with this phrase, is anyone that's within hearing distance of the clock tower has to defend the village's honor, to the death, right? I think that phrase came over when they founded New Orleans, because I very much feel that in the city, right?
That people expect you to defend the team no matter what. Yeah.
Defend the city of New Orleans, right? I mean, in every way, right? Whether it's political, we all know we have elected, maybe corrupt political officials, but there are political officials, so we defend them to some degree, right? Edwin Edwards was beloved in some circles, even though he was going to jail, right? It feels the same way sometimes about the sports teams here. Yes, they can make mistakes, but you defend them. And you have to walk that line a little bit of like, when do you choose to be critical? Because people here are very passionate about the city, and it's one of the great things about the city. It's what I love about it.
Sure.
Very, very much us versus them kind of mentality. I think we reveled in that for centuries here.
Yeah.
That New Orleans is something of an island here in the Deep South, and we're proud of it.
Yeah.
We like being different than the rest of the South, the rest of America, and I think that goes back to the very beginnings of this great city.
But yeah, no, that is the thing. People sometimes misunderstand, I think, your role and my role to a degree as well.
Correct.
The job is not to be a cheerleader. The job is to report honestly and accurately on what's going on. And in your case, as a columnist, have an opinion as well. So that's the job. The way you do that is you're honest and you're fair. And I've always said, I write a review of somebody, I want to be able to stand there and in front of them and read that review to them and be comfortable with that. And same thing with you. You've got to be able to, because you see these people all the time, the coaches, the players, the administrators, you've got to be able to look them in the eye and back up what you've written about them.
Right, and so the best example I can give is, during Bountygate, when it got really ugly for a while, Sean Payton was suspended for a year. It was a very difficult period of time for him, and he kind of lost his way after that. You remember the team went 2014 to 16, they went 7-9. I was pretty critical of Sean Payton because that was back in his younger days, and he was full of vim and vigor as one of his strengths, but also one of his weaknesses. And I think I know he would admit that later in his career as he learned and matured as a head coach. Sean Payton basically didn't talk to me for about 2 years. In some ways, I was kind of blackballed out there. I was ostracized.
So you would go to the press conferences or hang out.
He would answer my question in a public forum and everything, but he was not. What Sean would always tell you, that he'd use this phrase all the time: "You're not going to win any jump balls with me." In other words, if things are even, my competitors were going to get fed stories, and that's just part of what you have to put up with. But to his credit, he came around. Like about 2 years later, he buried the hatchet with me. We mended fences. And I always thought it was funny is that Sean Payton, the one I was most critical of, I have a very strong relationship now. We've developed a very healthy respect for each other. He's without question the best coach I've ever covered and the best coach in franchise history. It's indisputable. But he was able to move on from it, but yet some fans still hold the grudge. The one I was most critical of has moved on. It's just the way it goes sometimes.
Absolutely. If you're just tuning in, my guest today is Times-Picayune and NOLA.com sports columnist Jeff Duncan. Were you surprised that Peyton left the team, that he stepped away?
A little. I mean, that was a difficult time trying to pin that down. So yeah, I think I was, because he typically would go through this. He grinds himself into a pulp each year. He works these extraordinary long hours. It's physically demanding, mentally demanding, and he exhausts himself in the mission every year, and his staff. And so he would typically go through this kind of moment of reflection and circumspection after the year of like, am I going to keep doing this or not? So he'd gone through this before.
Yeah.
And talking to sources in the building, people in the building, they said, yeah, he's got to go through this and he'll come around and come back. So that's what we all thought was going to happen again. He'd gone down to Cabo with his wife and was basically trying to decide his future. And this time he said, you know what, I need to step away. I think he just had burnt himself out. It had been 16 years here. That's unprecedented. We'd never had a coach here. You see it happen in that business a lot, Keith. I can think of Urban Meyer had to step away, or Ara Parsegian back in the day at Notre Dame. Heck, Sean McVay, who's in his late 30s, hasn't coached as long as Sean, almost walked away from the Rams a few years ago. It's very typical, and I think the problem that a lot of people felt was they felt like he walked away once things got difficult. And I've talked to him about that. And when is the good time to walk away? There is no good time. I mean, he's going to walk away in the middle of a Super Bowl run. If you walk away when you're not in a run, everybody thinks you quit. But I can tell you, I visited him out in Denver earlier this year, and he's turning that franchise around just like he did here. He very much misses New Orleans. He considers New Orleans home. He never thought that would be the case. Wasn't from here. But I think, like a lot of us, once you move away, you start to realize, how special this place is. And he told me he's going to end his career here, whether it's in coaching or in another role, or just coming back here to retire.
Wow.
That's how much he misses the place. So a lot of people, I think, misunderstood that he wanted out of here, and that really wasn't the case.
The big story of the 2024 season, of course, was the firing of Sean Payton's successor, Dennis Allen. My read on it, regardless of his success or not success as a coach, I mean, he seems like a decent guy. He seems like a very cool guy. So that's hard, I guess, to cover that, because you're reporting, he is a good guy, but yet the results weren't there on the field. So you got to tell it like it is.
Yeah, and that was a difficult week. And you're right. He's a great guy, great father, great husband, and a great coach. I mean, he was a very good coach. You can be a very good coach and not be a great head coach. It's very difficult to make that transition. I think of Steve Spagnuolo, who was here for 1 year back in the early days of Peyton, and is now developed into the best defensive coordinator in the NFL. He had a horrible tenure as the St. Louis Rams head coach, one of the worst records in NFL history as a head coach, but he's a tremendous coach.
Yeah.
And he's won Super Bowl rings now with the Chiefs. So it's not uncommon for that transition to be difficult. Now, what was difficult was going out there. to give you a little backstory. As we know, you and I have been in this city a long time. It's a small town, right? It's a small, big town.
Oh, yeah.
So if your sources can kind of tell you, lead you in the right direction. I had gotten word a few days before that Panthers game that if Dennis Allen lost that game, that he was in trouble. Others were saying he was definitely out. So we were prepared if he lost. None of us thought they would lose. At the time, the Panthers had won one game. They were the worst team in the league. So I never thought it would come to fruition. But when they did lose that game, we were activated as a staff and we're ready to go. And the beat reporters, Luke Johnson and Matt Paris, were in Carolina. They were in Charlotte for the game. I was not. I was back here. So I drove out to the facility at 7 a.m. on Monday because I foresaw what was going to happen, that the hammer was probably going to drop that morning. They were going to have a team meeting. They weren't going to let him go address the team if they were going to make a decision. So I was in the parking lot. It was a very difficult time, right? It's not a fun part of the job. You feel a little bit like a vulture, frankly, watching this happen, but you have to do it. You have to go out there and try and get a comment from a man who you respect, who's just had a crushing, day in his life and just been fired. And I saw Dennis walk out to his Mercedes, and I had to go up and try and confront him with security around. It was not a pretty scene, and it's not something you're proud of, but you do have to do it in case he wants to comment.
Say something, right.
Yeah, and he did not, and I understood it, and he issued a statement later on. But that's part of the job. That's part of the job you have to do, not necessarily what you want to do.
Absolutely, absolutely, it can be tough. If you're just tuning in, my guest today is Times-Picayune and NOLA.com sports columnist Jeff Duncan. You've written several books about the team, From Bags to Riches, the chronicle of the Saints' comeback story after Hurricane Katrina and winning the Super Bowl. Great read. I mean, it's like a movie script. I mean, as I think back on the season, incredible. Your latest book project is co-writing Steve Gleason's memoir, A Life Impossible. The Steve Gleason story, what amazes me about that is, talk about life being a game of inches. Had he not blocked that punt in that comeback game in the Superdome after Katrina, if he'd have just been a regular special teams guy who didn't make this miraculous play, would he have gotten the support he's gotten in this ALS battle? Would he have become this icon of the city and the ALS fight? Had he not made that one particular play?
Well, he's been asked that before, and he actually, in the book, in A Life Impossible, I think the last chapter, he talks about that because one of his fellow ALS patients asked him that at an event, and he told him, I wouldn't even be here. I would not be alive if I had blocked that punt, because he would probably not have had the support, like you said, and probably the motivation to continue living with this horrible disease. I mean, Steve was diagnosed in 2011. He's coming up now in January 2011, he's coming up on 14 years.
Right.
Most patients that are diagnosed live 2 to 3 years. It's such a difficult disease. It's the quality of life devolves so quickly. But Steve found motivation in his family and his wife, obviously his amazing wife, Michelle, but also I think in his role now in leading kind of the forefront of ALS awareness through Team Gleason, the foundation. I think he sees himself as something of a beacon to people with the disease. And I think he feels that, I don't know if responsibility is the right word, but I think he feels like a lot of people look to him for inspiration. And I think that would not be there if he would not have blocked that punt. And the greatest thing about that, and I've written this before and I've said this before, Steve was the perfect hero there, right? He was the perfect person to block that punt because he got New Orleans. I mean, I've covered this team a long time. A lot of players come and go, and they don't get it. Steve was one of the first athletes I covered that embraced the culture here, that dove into the culture. I mean, he lived in the city. At the time when he was on the team, he was one of maybe a handful, maybe even fewer, Keith, that lived in city proper. Most lived out in gated communities and Destrehan or North Shore. Yeah, they lived in kind of golf course communities and didn't get a real feel for the team, or for the city, I should say. Steve was the exact opposite. He lived in a one-bedroom apartment in uptown New Orleans, did not have a TV, rode his bike around. I've written about this before. This is how Steve's wired. Instead of buying a bike helmet like a normal person, he coerced the equipment manager, Dan Simmons at the time, to give him an old Saints helmet, and he took the face mask off, and that's what he wore as a helmet. So you can imagine this long-haired guy riding around with a Saints helmet on a bike, and he's a pro athlete.
Yeah.
He immediately kind of fell in love with the city's irreverence, its eccentricities. So he understood exactly what he had done that night. And then he started dating Michelle, a New Orleans girl, and we all know when you marry a New Orleans girl, you're pretty much going to be in New Orleans probably the rest of your life. But Michelle's family, deeply ingrained in the community, understood how important family is. Steve comes from a bit of a fractured family, so he fell quickly in love with Michelle and her family and how they introduced him to the city and everything that comes with it. And so Steve understood that night he had done something remarkable, something that was going to be historic.
Yeah.
Whereas if another player had done it, probably wouldn't have that sense of perspective.
Right.
And I can still remember going in the locker room, and he was still down there late. I had an early crushing deadline that night. It was a Monday night football game. As you know, those deadlines are tough. And I didn't know if he'd still be down there. He was still at his locker holding court, and I think reveling in what he'd done. And that interview was so powerful. I think he said something to the effect of, I'm the little boy that dreams of doing something, special in the NFL, and tonight I did it. And it was like a culmination of his whole career in that one play. it was just powerful that night.
And then, like I said, the dramatic and tragic turn his life takes, that event, again, became even larger and it loomed even larger because, that gave him the platform to become this voice for survivors of ALS, So it's incredible. We only got a minute and a half here left. Writing the book with him, again, exercise and patience, because he did it all with his eyes, right? Picking out all the words and all that sort of stuff. But again, it's given him more of a platform to be this advocate. And for you, as a journalist, to cover that story again, that's the kind of stuff you dream about.
Yeah, the most extraordinary project I've ever been a part of. I feel so honored and grateful to have worked on this with Steve and Michelle. It was definitely a 3-person project. The writing process was extraordinary. As you said, Steve used eye tracking technology to write the book letter by letter, word by word, line by line. Obviously, it's not nearly as fast as you or I would write. So we had some challenges, but to see his will up close on a daily basis. I'm friends with him. I've been friends for a long time. I knew the challenges, but to see it on a daily basis, I think the traits and the characteristics that allowed him to forge an 8-year NFL career as an undrafted player and become a captain and an all-pro alternate, he used those same traits: discipline, attention to detail, drive, and this book project.
No, it's incredible. And I'm so glad you were able to tell that story and all the other stories you have told and will continue to tell about the Saints and their passionate fan base. So, Jeff Duncan, thank you so much for joining me today on Let's Talk.
Thank you very much, Keith. I enjoyed being here.
All right. Once again, I'm Keith Spera. I'll see you next time on Let's Talk.